In a cramped repair shop on the forgotten side of town, something extraordinary is about to happen. Marco Reyes has spent years fixing broken timepieces for neighbors who can barely afford his modest fees. His weathered hands hold decades of skill, passed down from his grandfather, treating each watch like a piece of someone's heart. When Vivian Langford steps through his door on a stormy Tuesday afternoon, she's just another wealthy customer with a damaged luxury watch. But this isn't any ordinary repair job. The shattered timepiece belonged to her late mother, and Marco can see the pain behind her guarded eyes. What starts as a simple transaction becomes something neither expected. As Marco carefully restores each delicate gear and spring, he's unknowingly mending something much more precious than metal and crystal. This billionaire heiress, used to buying her way through life, discovers a man who values craftsmanship over profit and treats time itself as sacred. But will their connection survive when the world discovers what happens when extreme wealth meets humble wisdom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Reyes Watch Repair, casting long shadows across the cluttered workbench where Marco's grandfather had spent 40 years of his life. The same bench where Marco now sat, magnifying glass, perched over his eye, working on a child's plastic watch with the same reverence he'd show a Rolex. At 34, Marco Reyes carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that worth wasn't measured in dollars. His calloused fingers moved with surgical precision as he replaced the tiny battery, his dark eyes focused with an intensity that spoke of genuine care. The watch belonged to Isabella Martinez, 8 years old, whose mother cleaned offices downtown for minimum wage. Isabella had saved her allowance for 3 months to buy the pink timepiece, and when it stopped working after just 2 weeks, her tears had moved Marco more than any luxury commission ever could. The shop itself told the story of 3 generations of craftsmanship. Wooden cases lined the walls, filled with timepieces in various states of repair. Some were family heirlooms, brought in by elderly customers who spoke in whispered tones about their father's pocket watches from the old country. Others were modern pieces, sleek and digital, belonging to young parents who needed their fitness trackers working for the morning jog. Marco treated them all the same. Behind the counter, framed photographs showed the shop's history. His great-grandfather, Eduardo Reyes, standing proudly outside the original location in 1954, his hands already stained with the oils and metals of his trade. His grandfather, Roberto, at the same counter in the 1980s, teaching a young Marco how to hold tiny screws without dropping them. The progression of time captured in still moments, each generation passing down not just skills, but a philosophy. "About time itself, mijo," came a weathered voice from the back room. Roberto Reyes, now 83, emerged slowly, his cane tapping against the worn wooden floor. Despite his age, his eyes remained sharp, the same dark brown as his grandson's, still capable of spotting a counterfeit watch from across the room. "Buenos dias, abuelo," Marco replied without looking up from his work. "How did you sleep? Like an old engine that needs more oil each morning." Roberto chuckled, settling into his worn leather chair beside the window. This had been his routine. For the past 5 years, ever since his arthritis made the delicate work impossible, but he still came down each morning, still offered advice, still charmed customers with stories about the watches he'd repaired over the decades. The neighborhood around them had changed dramatically since Eduardo first opened the shop. What had once been a thriving working-class community was now caught between gentrification and decay. The bodega next door had been replaced by an artisanal coffee shop that charged $8 for a cup, while across the street, half the storefronts stood empty, their windows covered with plywood and graffiti. But Reyes Watch Repair remained, an island of consistency in a sea of change. Marco had inherited more than just the business. He'd inherited a responsibility to the community. Mrs. Chen brought in her late husband's Timex every few months, not because it needed repair, but because she needed someone to listen to her stories. About their 50-year marriage, young Miguel Rodriguez stopped by after school to watch Marco work, his eyes wide with fascination, as tiny gears came together like mechanical poetry. The financial reality, however, was far from poetic. Marco kept the books in a ledger that had belonged to his grandfather, the same leather-bound volume that Roberto had used, and his father before him. The pages were worn soft with use, the columns filled with careful handwriting in black ink, recording every repair, every payment, every small transaction that kept the family business alive. But lately, there had been more red ink than black, more IOUs than actual payments. Roberto's ledger told the story of their struggles in numbers that couldn't lie. The rent on the shop had doubled in the past 3 years as the neighborhood gentrified. Around them, the cost of replacement parts had risen steadily, while the number of customers seeking repairs had dwindled. People threw away broken watches now instead of fixing them, preferring to buy new rather than preserve the old. Many customers paid what they could, when they could. Mrs. Delacroix settled her bill with homemade bread and stories about her late husband's Navy service. Carlos from the auto shop traded watch repairs for work on Marco's perpetually troubled delivery van. The Patel family, who ran the corner market, kept a running tab that somehow never quite got settled, but included free coffee and occasional groceries during particularly lean weeks. Marco accepted it all with grace, understanding that sometimes dignity meant more than profit, that being part of a community meant supporting each other through difficult times. His great-grandfather had built the business on these principles, and Roberto had maintained them through economic downturns and social changes. Marco would do no less, even if it meant his own financial security remained uncertain. His apartment, above the shop, reflected this same humble philosophy. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, each piece carrying its own story. The kitchen table where he and Roberto shared their evening meals had been his great-grandmother's, its surface worn smooth by decades of family dinners and homework sessions. The walls were decorated not with expensive art, but with photographs of customers holding their restored timepieces, their faces glowing with the joy that comes from seeing something beloved made whole again. The living room served double duty as Marco's study, its shelves lined with technical manuals, horological, journals and books about the history of timekeeping. He spent his evenings reading about new techniques, studying the masters of the craft, always seeking to improve his skills. In one corner sat his pride and joy, a 1920s lathe that he'd restored himself, a machine capable of creating parts so precise they could bring century-old watches back to life. Roberto's medical expenses were a constant source of worry, a weight that Marco carried but never discussed with his grandfather. The medication for Roberto's diabetes alone cost more than Marco made in a good week. The physical therapy sessions that kept his grandfather mobile were a luxury they could barely afford, but Marco found ways to make it work. He'd taken on additional projects, worked longer hours, even considered joining one of the high-end repair shops downtown where the pay was better, but the soul of the work was different. Yet leaving Roberto alone was unthinkable, and abandoning the neighborhood shop felt like betraying everything his family had built. Instead, Marco had developed a reputation among serious collectors for his exceptional skill with vintage pieces. Word traveled quietly through circles of horologists about the young man in the forgotten part of town who could make a 1940s Omega Pearl like new, who could restore a damaged Patek Philippe to museum-quality condition. These occasional high-paying jobs kept the lights on and Roberto's medications current, but they also reminded Marco of the vast gulf between his world and the world of his wealthy clients. The contrast was stark and sometimes painful. These collectors lived in penthouses and country estates, their watch collections worth more than Marco would see in a lifetime. They spoke casually about $1,000 repairs the way Roberto talked about the weather, their biggest concern being whether their investment pieces would maintain their value. Yet when they left their precious timepieces in Marco's care, they did so with complete trust, recognizing that his hands possessed something that couldn't be bought, genuine reverence for the craft, an understanding that each watch represented not just mechanical engineering, but human artistry, family history, personal memory. This morning, as Marco finished Isabella's repair and carefully placed the pink watch in its small box, he reflected on the peculiar mathematics of his life. He could make a Patek Philippe sing with precision, but he couldn't afford to buy groceries without checking his wallet twice. He could restore a century-old pocket watch to perfect working order, but his own future remained uncertain. Tick by tick, the bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Patterson entered, her weekly visit as regular as clockwork. She carried her husband's gold Bulova, the same watch she brought in every Tuesday, claiming it was running slow. Marco knew better. The watch kept perfect time, never varying by more than a few seconds. Mrs. Patterson simply needed the excuse to visit, to have someone examine her most precious possession with the care and respect it deserved. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Marco said, his voice warm with genuine affection. "How's Harold's watch treating you this week?" "Oh, you know how it is," she replied, settling into the chair beside Roberto's, who nodded his greeting with the courtly politeness of his generation. "It seems to be losing time again. Harold always said it needed a gentle touch." As she began her familiar story about her husband's watch, about how he'd worn it to work every day for 37 years at the post office, never missing a shift, never late for anything important, Marco listened with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes people needed their memories handled as carefully as their timepieces. Mrs. Patterson's weekly visits weren't really about watch repair. They were about maintaining a connection to the man she'd loved for 43 years, about keeping his memory alive through the ritual of caring for something he'd treasured. This was the real work of Reyes watch repair, Marco knew. Not just fixing mechanisms, but maintaining connections to love, to history, to the moments that made life meaningful. In a world that moved faster every day, where people replaced rather than repaired, where relationships were as disposable as yesterday's technology, his shop served as a sanctuary for those who understood that some things were worth preserving. Roberto watched his grandson work with quiet pride, seeing in Marco's gentle handling of Mrs. Patterson's emotions the same care that Eduardo had shown his customers decades ago. The old man understood, perhaps better than Marco himself, that the shop's true value lay not in its profit margins, but in its role as a keeper of stories, a guardian of memories, a place where time was treated with the respect it deserved. Outside, the city hummed with its relentless pace, everyone rushing somewhere, checking their phones for the time, instead of wearing it on their wrists, measuring their lives in notifications and digital alerts, rather than the steady, reassuring tick of mechanical precision. But inside this small shop, time moved differently. Here, it was treated with reverence, each second valued, each moment worth preserving. Here, 3 generations of Reyes men had learned that time wasn't just something to be measured, but something to be honored. As the morning stretched toward noon and Mrs. Patterson finished her weekly reminiscence, Marco had no way of knowing that in just a few hours his carefully ordered world would be forever changed. He couldn't foresee that a woman carrying a broken watch and secrets that went deeper than he could imagine would walk through his door, bringing with her a story that would transform everything he thought he knew about time, love, and the distance between 2 hearts beating in different worlds. The storm arrived without warning, as September storms often do, turning the city streets into rivers and sending people scrambling for shelter. Marco was adjusting the ancient radio on his workbench, trying to coax classical music from its weathered speakers, when the thunder began in earnest. The sound rolled through the narrow streets like a freight train, rattling the shop's windows and causing the overhead lights to flicker. Roberto dozed peacefully in his chair, despite the commotion, his breathing steady and deep. At 83, he'd weathered enough storms to sleep through almost anything. Marco smiled at his grandfather's peaceful expression, then returned to his work on a 1960s Seiko that had been giving him trouble all morning. The rain came suddenly, a torrential downpour that drummed against the shop's tin roof like thousands of tiny hammers. Within minutes, the street outside transformed into a shallow river, carrying autumn leaves and urban debris in its swift current. Marco watched through the window as pedestrians pressed themselves against building walls, their umbrellas useless. Against the wind-driven deluge, it was precisely 2:47 p.m. when she appeared. At first, she was just a figure moving through the rain, her silhouette distorted by the water streaming down the glass. But as she approached the shop, Marco could see she was different from his usual customers. Her clothes, though soaked, bore the unmistakable cut of expensive tailoring. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful, even as she navigated the flooded sidewalk in heels that had never been intended for such conditions. The bell above the door chimed with unusual urgency as she pushed inside, bringing with her the scent of rain and something else, a perfume that probably cost more than Marco's monthly rent. Water dripped from her dark hair onto the worn wooden floor as she stood in the doorway, taking in the shop's humble interior with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything at once. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of understated beauty that came from good genetics and excellent self-care. Her navy suit, despite being thoroughly soaked, maintained its shape and elegance. But it was her hands that caught Marco's attention, manicured but not ostentatious, and trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, her voice carrying the crisp consonants of expensive education. "I know this isn't exactly—" She gestured vaguely at her wet clothes, then at the modest shop around her. "I was told you might be able to help." Marco set down his tools and approached the counter, noting how she seemed to hesitate before taking those final steps toward him. In his experience, people who entered his shop fell into two categories: those who belonged to the neighborhood and felt immediately at home, and those who clearly didn't, but had been driven by desperation or recommendation. This woman definitely belonged to the second category. "Of course," Marco replied, his tone gentle and professional. "What can I do for you?" She reached into her purse and withdrew a small black box, the kind used by high-end jewelers to transport precious items. Her fingers hesitated on the clasp, and for a moment, Marco thought she might change her mind and leave. Instead, she opened the box and carefully lifted out what had once been an exquisite timepiece. The watch was a mechanical work of art, or had been before whatever had happened to it. The case was rose gold, with intricate engravings around the bezel that spoke of old-world craftsmanship. The crystal was shattered, spiderwebbing across the pristine white face like a frozen moment of impact. The hands were bent at impossible angles, and through the broken crystal, Marco could see that several of the delicate gears had been displaced. But what struck him most was not the damage, but the age and quality of the piece itself. This was no modern luxury watch, despite its perfect condition before the damage. The style, the proportions, the particular shade of the rose gold. This was a timepiece from the 1940s or early 1950s, probably Swiss, and almost certainly a one-of-a-kind. Piece commissioned by someone with both excellent taste and considerable wealth. "What happened?" Marco asked softly, recognizing that the destruction of such a beautiful piece represented more than just property damage. The woman's composure wavered for just a moment. "It was on my nightstand. I knocked it off during—" She stopped, clearly, not wanting to share the details. "It hit a marble floor. I heard it happen, but I couldn't—" She took a breath, regaining her control. Can it be fixed? Marco lifted the watch carefully, feeling its weight, examining the damage through his magnifying glass. The mechanism was complex, far more intricate than most modern pieces. The level of craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each component had been finished by hand, decorated with engravings so fine they looked like lacework. This wasn't just a timepiece. It was a piece of history, a work of art that had been created by a master craftsman decades ago. "This is remarkable work," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "May I ask where it came from?" The woman's eyes, which had been guarded since she entered, seemed to soften slightly. "It was my mother's. It was made for her by a Swiss watchmaker in 1947. She wore it every day until—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Marco understood. He continued his examination, noting the tiny hallmarks inside the case, the particular style of the hands, the way the gears had been arranged. This wasn't just any Swiss watch. This was the work of someone truly exceptional, possibly even famous in horological circles. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. It would require weeks of painstaking work, sourcing period-appropriate parts, possibly even fabricating some components by hand. The woman watched his face as he worked, studying his expression with an intensity that suggested she was accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. Marco was vaguely aware of her scrutiny, but his attention remained focused on the timepiece before him. In his hands lay not just a broken watch, but someone's connection to their past, to love, to memory. "I can fix it," Marco said finally, setting the watch down carefully on a soft cloth. "But it won't be quick, and it won't be inexpensive. This kind of restoration requires sourcing vintage parts, some of which may no longer exist. I might have to fabricate certain components by hand using techniques that are rarely practiced anymore." "Money isn't a concern," she interrupted, then seemed to catch herself as if revealing too much. "I mean, I understand that quality work costs what it costs. What I need to know is whether it can truly be restored, or if it will just be functional." Marco looked up from the watch to meet her eyes directly. For the first time, he saw past the professional composure to something deeper, a vulnerability that spoke of genuine emotion, of loss that went beyond material value. "When I'm finished, it will be exactly as your mother wore it. Every tick, every visual detail, every tiny mechanism will work the way the original craftsman intended. It won't just be functional, it will be alive again." For the first time since entering the shop, the woman smiled, and Marco realized she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or perfect makeup. The smile transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth that her professional demeanor had kept hidden. "How long?" she asked. 3 to 4 weeks, possibly longer if I have difficulty finding the right parts. Some of these components," Marco gestured to the watch, "they don't make them anymore. I might have to fabricate some pieces by hand, working from photographs and technical drawings from the original manufacturer." She nodded, reaching into her purse for what Marco assumed would be a credit card. Instead, she withdrew a money clip, thick with cash, peeling off bills with the casual ease of someone for whom money truly wasn't a concern. The amount she placed on the counter was 3 times what Marco would have quoted for such a restoration, enough to cover Roberto's medications for 2 months and still leave a substantial sum for the shop's expenses. "My name is Vivian," she said, not offering a last name. "How should I contact you about the progress?" Marco handed her one of the shop's simple business cards, noting how carefully she studied it before placing it in her wallet. "I'll call you in a week with an update." "But Vivian," he used her name tentatively, as if testing how it felt, "this watch meant something special to your mother. I want you to know that I'll treat it with the care it deserves." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that suggested his words had touched something deeper than professional courtesy. "Thank you," she said simply. I appreciate that more than you know." As she prepared to leave, Roberto stirred in his chair, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature for 8 decades. He nodded politely to Vivian, who returned the gesture with a grace that spoke of good breeding and genuine respect for elders. "Es una reliquia hermosa," Roberto said quietly, gesturing toward the watch. "A beautiful relic. Your mother had excellent taste." Vivian paused, surprised by the old man's observation. "Thank you." "Yes, she did." She hesitated, then added, "She would have liked this place, I think. She believed in preserving beautiful things." After she left, the shop seemed different somehow, as if her presence had subtly altered the atmosphere. Marco found himself staring at the broken watch, thinking not just about the technical challenges ahead, but about the woman who had entrusted him with something so precious. There was a story there, he sensed, deeper than the simple narrative of a damaged timepiece. Roberto cleared his throat softly. "Mijo," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "That woman carries more than just a broken watch." Marco looked up at his grandfather, recognizing the tone that meant Roberto had observed something significant. "What do you mean, abuelo?" "I've seen many people bring us their treasures over the years," Roberto replied, his weathered hands folded over his cane. "Most come because they need something fixed, but some come because they need something healed. That woman, she's looking for more than just a repair." As Marco carefully wrapped Vivian's mother's watch in protective cloth and placed it in the shop's safe, he couldn't shake the feeling that Roberto was right. There had been something in her eyes, something that suggested the broken timepiece was just the beginning of a much larger story. And somehow, without fully understanding why, Marco found himself looking forward to discovering what that story might be. The morning after the storm found Marco at his workbench before dawn, the shop's fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows as he examined Vivian's mother's watch under high-powered magnification. Sleep had eluded him, his mind racing with questions about the timepiece's origins and the technical challenges that lay ahead. The watch rested in a custom-made cradle, each damaged component carefully catalogued and photographed for reference. Roberto shuffled downstairs earlier than usual, drawn by the sound of Marco's activity. "You couldn't sleep either, mijo?" he asked, settling into his chair with a knowing smile. "This piece," Marco said, not looking up from his examination. "It's more complex than I initially thought. Look at these engravings on the movement." He carefully adjusted the magnification and stepped aside so Roberto could see. The old man leaned forward, his experienced eyes studying the intricate details. Even damaged, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Tiny flowers and geometric patterns decorated surfaces that would never be seen once the watch was assembled. A level of artistic dedication that spoke of masters who took pride in every aspect of their work. "Swiss, definitely," Roberto murmured. "But not from any of the major houses. This is independent work, probably a commission piece." He paused, his weathered finger hovering over a particular marking. "That hallmark there, I've seen it before. Many years ago." Marco felt his pulse quicken. Roberto's memory for maker's marks was legendary among collectors, a database of knowledge accumulated over 6 decades of handling timepieces from around the world. "Where, abuelo, do you remember?" "Give me time," Roberto replied, settling back in his chair. "Memory is like a fine watch. Sometimes you must wind it carefully to make it work properly." As the morning progressed, Marco began the delicate process of complete disassembly. Each component required documentation, careful handling, and assessment for repair or replacement. The crystal would need to be custom cut, probably by one of the few remaining specialists who still worked with vintage specifications. The hands would require straightening and refinishing, but it was the movement itself that presented the greatest challenge. Several of the gears showed damage that went beyond simple realignment. The balance wheel had been knocked out of true, its delicate adjustment mechanism compromised. Most concerning, the mainspring appeared to have suffered microscopic fractures that could cause it to fail catastrophically if not addressed. Marco reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. After 3 rings, a gravelly voice answered in heavily accented English. Hermann Steiner, Horological Supplies. Mr. Steiner, this is Marco Reyes in the States. I have a restoration project that requires some very specific vintage components. Ah, young Reyes, Hermann's voice warmed with recognition. Your grandfather taught you well, I hear. What do you need? Marco described the watch in detail, reading off the serial numbers and maker's marks he'd identified. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by what sounded like papers rustling. This piece, Hermann said finally. You are certain of these markings? Absolutely. I've photographed everything. I can send you the images if you'd like. Another pause. Yes, send them. But Marco, if this is what I think it is, you are working on something very special, very rare. The components you need, they will not be easy to find. I understand. Cost isn't the primary concern here. It's not about cost, my young friend. It's about availability. Some of these parts, they stopped making them in 1948. I will make inquiries, but you may need to consider fabrication from original specifications. After ending the call, Marco spent the rest of the morning researching vintage Swiss watchmaking techniques. His computer screen filled with technical drawings from the 1940s, patents for gear-cutting methods that had been superseded by modern machinery, and photographs of tools that were now museum pieces. The specialized equipment he would need was expensive and difficult to acquire. A gear-cutting lathe of the appropriate vintage would cost more than the shop made in a good year. But as Marco studied the damaged timepiece, he realized that this restoration represented more than just a business transaction. This was an opportunity to practice his craft at the highest level, to work on a piece that few watchmakers would ever encounter. By noon, Roberto had dozed off in his chair, the morning's excitement having tired him more than usual. Marco worked in companionable silence, his movements precise and deliberate as he continued cataloguing components. The shop's familiar sounds, the tick of various clocks, the hum of the ventilation fan, the distant traffic created a meditative background that helped him focus. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Mrs. Chen arrived with her husbands. Timex followed by young Miguel Rodriguez, who lingered by the workbench, watching Marco's careful movements with fascination. "What's that one?" Miguel asked, pointing to Vivian's watch. "Something very special," Marco replied, carefully covering the timepiece with a soft cloth. "A watch that tells a story about craftsmanship and family. Like the stories Mr. Roberto, it tells exactly like that, Miguel. Every watch has a story, but some stories are more important than others." As the boy helped sweep the shop floor, a daily ritual that earned him $1 and Marco's undivided attention for the technique lesson that followed, Marco found himself thinking about Vivian. Her expensive clothes and confident demeanor suggested wealth, but there had been something else in her manner, a guardedness that spoke of someone accustomed to being approached for what she could provide rather than who she was. The phone rang just as Miguel was leaving for home. Marco answered with his standard greeting, but the voice on the other end made him pause. "This is Vivian. I hope I'm not calling too early for an update." "Not at all," Marco replied, surprised by how pleased he was to hear from her. "I was just finishing the initial assessment, and," Marco chose his words carefully, "it's going to be a challenging restoration, but entirely possible. I've identified most of the damaged components and begun sourcing replacement parts. Some will need to be fabricated to original specifications. How long do you think that will take?" "At least 3 weeks, possibly longer. I want to be certain that everything is done correctly rather than quickly." There was a pause before she responded. "I appreciate that. Quality over speed." My mother would have approved of that philosophy. Something in her tone invited further conversation. She must have been very special to have commissioned such a beautiful piece. "She was," Vivian said simply. "She had a saying about time that It was the only true luxury, because once it's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. Your mother was a wise woman. Yes, she was. I'm afraid I didn't always appreciate her wisdom when I was younger. Marco found himself wanting to know more, to understand the story behind the broken watch and the woman who had brought it to him. But something told him that pushing for details would be a mistake. Instead, he simply said, "I'll take very good care of it." "I know you will," she replied. "Thank you, Marco." After she hung up, Marco sat staring at the phone, replaying the conversation in his mind. There had been something different in her voice this time, a warmth that hadn't been there during their first meeting. Roberto stirred in his chair, opening, his eyes with the alertness of someone who had been listening despite appearing to sleep. "The lady with the broken watch?" he asked. "Yes." She called for an update. Roberto nodded thoughtfully. "She's thinking about more than just the repair, mijo. I can hear it in your voice, too." Marco felt heat rise in his cheeks. "It's just a business transaction, abuelo." "Of course," Roberto replied with a knowing smile. "Just like your grandmother's. Watch repair was just a business transaction. And look how that turned out. 53 years of marriage and 4 grandchildren. As the afternoon wore on, Marco returned to his research, but found his concentration divided between technical specifications and memories of dark eyes that had held both vulnerability and strength. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he began to suspect that Roberto's prediction about this being more than just a repair might prove prophetic. 3 days into the restoration, Marco made a discovery that changed everything. He was carefully removing the damaged crystal when something caught his eye. A tiny gap where the case back met the main housing. Using his finest tools, he managed to open a hidden compartment that had been invisible until the watch's structure was compromised by the fall. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded silk, was a small photograph. The black and white image was no larger than a postage stamp, but perfectly preserved. It showed a young woman in 1940s fashion, her dark hair styled in victory rolls, her smile radiant with joy. She wore the very watch Marco was now repairing, its face pristine and new. But what struck him most was the resemblance. This had to be Vivian's mother, and the similarities between them were unmistakable. Marco's hands trembled slightly as he held the photograph up to the light. The woman in the picture couldn't have been more than 25, probably younger. There was something eternal about her expression, a happiness so pure it transcended the decades between then and now. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Elena, Christmas 1947. Roberto had been watching from his chair, and when Marco showed him the discovery, the old man's eyes widened with recognition, and something deeper, a mixture of surprise and understanding that suggested pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "Ay, Dios mío," Roberto whispered, taking the photograph with reverent care. "I remember now, the hallmark, the style. This is the work of Jacques Dubois." Marco felt his breath catch. Jacques Dubois was legendary among serious horologists, a Swiss master who had created perhaps 50 timepieces in his entire career, each one a masterwork of engineering and artistry. His watches were the holy grail of collectors, rarely appearing at auction, and when they did, commanding prices that most people couldn't imagine. "Are you certain, abuelo? Look here." Roberto pointed to a nearly invisible mark inside the case. "That's his signature. I saw one of his pieces once in 1963 when a collector brought it to your grandfather for cleaning. Eduardo was so nervous handling it that his hands shook for an hour afterward. The implications hit Marco like a physical force. If this was truly a Dubois original, Vivian's mother's watch wasn't just valuable, it was priceless. Museums would fight for the privilege of displaying such a piece. Private collectors would offer sums that could buy houses, entire businesses. But more than the monetary value, Marco now understood the true weight of the responsibility Vivian had placed in his hands. This wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a piece of horological history, one of perhaps a dozen Dubois pieces known to still exist. His phone rang at precisely 3 o'clock, and somehow Marco knew it would be Vivian before he answered. "Good afternoon." Her voice carried the same professional warmth as before, but Marco thought he detected something else, an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested she'd been thinking about calling all day. "Vivian, I'm glad you called. I've made a discovery that I think you should see in person." There was a pause. "A discovery?" "I found something hidden in your mother's watch. Something I think she meant for you to find eventually." "Hidden? What kind of something?" Marco looked down at the tiny photograph resting on his workbench. "It's better if I show you. Could you come by the shop?" Another pause, longer this time. Yes, I could come by. When would be convenient?" "Whenever works for you. I'll be here until 6. I could be there in an hour." After hanging up, Marco found himself pacing the small shop, alternately excited and nervous about Vivian's reaction to his discovery. Roberto watched his grandson's restless energy with amusement. "You're more worked up about showing her that photograph than you were about discovering a Dubois original," the old man observed. "This changes everything, abuelo. If word gets out about what this watch really is, then you don't let word get out," Roberto replied simply. "Some things are more important than money or fame. That young woman trusted you with her mother's memory. That trust is worth more than any publicity." When Vivian arrived, she was dressed more casually than before, dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that somehow made her seem more approachable while doing nothing to diminish her natural elegance. Marco noticed she'd taken time with her appearance, despite the short notice, and he wondered if she was as nervous about this meeting as he was. "Thank you for calling," she said, settling into the chair beside Roberto's workbench. "I have to admit, I've been thinking about the watch constantly since I dropped it off." "Before I show you what I found," Marco said carefully, "I need you to know that your mother's watch is more valuable than either of us initially realized. Much more valuable." Vivian's expression remained composed, but Marco caught a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or concern. "How much more valuable?" The watchmaker who created this piece was Jacques Dubois, one of the greatest masters who ever lived. He made perhaps 50 watches in his entire career. This could be worth— Marco paused, struggling with the magnitude of the number. Potentially more than $1 million. If he expected shock or excitement, Vivian disappointed him. Instead, she simply nodded, as if confirming something she'd suspected. "My mother never told me the exact details, but I knew it was special. She said it was made for her by someone who understood that time was precious." "There's more," Marco said gently. He picked up the tiny photograph and held it out to her. "I found this hidden inside the case." Vivian's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Her hand went to her mouth as she saw the image, and Marco watched tears well up in her eyes. She took the photograph with shaking fingers, holding it as if it were made of the most fragile glass. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I've never seen this picture. Look at her. She's so young, so happy." The writing on the back says, "Elena, Christmas, 1947. That was the year she met my father," Vivian said, her voice thick with emotion. "She must have had this made to commemorate their engagement. She used to tell me stories about that Christmas, how magical it was, how she felt like the luckiest woman in the world." Roberto cleared his throat softly. "Your mother had excellent taste in watchmakers. Dubois was known for creating hiding places in his timepieces, secret compartments for love letters, photographs, small treasures. He believed that watches should hold more than just time." Vivian looked up at the old man with gratitude. She would have loved knowing that someone understood her romantic nature. She turned back to Marco. "How did you know to look for it?" "The impact damage created a gap in the case that shouldn't have been there. When I investigated, I found the hidden compartment." Marco paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think your mother intended for you to find this someday. Maybe not. Under these circumstances, but eventually. She always said the watch would tell me everything I needed to know about love when the time was right. Vivian wiped her eyes, managing a smile through her tears. I thought she was being poetic. I should have known she was being literal. As they sat in the quiet shop, the afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows, Marco felt something shift between them. The formal distance of their previous interactions had dissolved, replaced by an intimacy born of shared discovery. Vivian was no longer just a wealthy customer. She was a woman reconnecting with her mother's memory, finding pieces of a love story she'd never fully known. "Will you be able to fix the hidden compartment too?" she asked. "Of course. When I'm finished, everything will work exactly as Dubois intended. The photograph will be safe and you'll be able to access it whenever you want." "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding this, for understanding how important it is, for treating my mother's watch like it matters." "It does matter," Marco replied. "More than you know." As Vivian prepared to leave, carefully tucking the photograph into her purse, she paused at the door. "Marco, would it be all right if I called to check on the progress again? I know you said 3 weeks, but you can call any time," he replied, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. After she left, Roberto sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "That woman is carrying more than just her mother's memory, mijo. She's carrying her mother's capacity for love. The question is whether she knows it yet." Marco looked down at the disassembled watch, its components spread across his workbench, like the pieces of a story waiting to be told. Somehow he suspected that putting this timepiece back together would require more than just technical skill. It would require understanding the kind of love that hides photographs in secret compartments and trusts strangers with irreplaceable treasures. The specialized gear-cutting lathe arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by 2 men who seemed bewildered by the idea of hauling such precise machinery into what they clearly considered a rundown neighborhood. Marco had spent the previous week preparing a space for it, clearing out a corner of the shop and reinforcing the floor to handle the weight of the century-old Swiss equipment. Hermann Steiner had located the machine in the estate of a deceased collector in Vienna, complete, with the original cutting tools and technical manuals. The cost had consumed most of Vivian's advance payment, but Marco knew it was essential for creating the replacement gear that would bring her mother's watch back to life. Working by lamplight in the early morning hours before the shop opened, Marco began the painstaking process of hand-forging the tiny component. The gear itself was no larger than a button, but its 17 teeth had to be cut with a precision measured in thousandths of an inch. Each tooth required individual attention, filed and shaped by hand to match the specifications he'd calculated. From the damaged original, Roberto often joined him during these pre-dawn sessions, bringing coffee and offering guidance born from 6 decades of similar work. The old man's arthritis prevented him from handling the delicate tools, but his eyes remained sharp enough to spot imperfections that Marco might miss. "Patience, mijo," Roberto would say when Marco showed signs of frustration. Dubois himself probably spent weeks on each gear. "We cannot rush perfection." By the 2nd week of October, Marco had established a rhythm. Days were spent on regular repairs and customer service, while evenings belonged to Vivian's watch. The shop's regular customers had begun to notice the covered timepiece on the special workbench, but Marco deflected their curiosity with polite vagueness about a complicated restoration project. Mrs. Patterson arrived for her weekly visit, noting the unusual equipment and the faint smell of metal polish that now permeated the shop. "You're working on something special," she observed, settling into her usual chair. "Every repair is special, Mrs. Patterson," Marco replied diplomatically, though they both knew this was different. "Harold always said you could tell a craftsman's passion by the tools he was willing to invest in," she said, gesturing toward the lathe. "He would have been impressed by your dedication." It was during one of these evening sessions that Vivian began appearing unannounced. The first time she claimed to be in the neighborhood for dinner and decided to check on the progress. The Second time, she admitted she'd been curious about the work being done after hours. By the third visit, they'd both stopped pretending she needed an excuse. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said on a Thursday evening, finding Marco hunched over the cutting lathe with a jeweler's magnifying lens strapped to his head. "Not at all," he replied, straightening up and removing the magnification gear. "Actually, I was hoping you'd stop by. I wanted to show you something." He led her to the workbench, where a partially assembled movement lay exposed under bright lighting. Most of the gears were now in place, their polished surfaces catching the light like tiny mirrors. The replacement gear he'd been crafting sat in its designated position, indistinguishable from the original components. "It's beautiful," Vivian said, leaning closer to examine the intricate mechanism. "Like a piece of jewelry designed by an engineer." "That's exactly what it is," Marco replied. Dubois believed that function and beauty were inseparable. Every component that couldn't be seen was finished to the same standard as those that could. As she studied the movement, Marco found himself studying her. The expensive clothes had given way to more casual attire during these evening visits: well-cut jeans, cashmere sweaters, leather boots that suggested comfort over status. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was often slightly mussed, as if she'd been running her hands through it during what he was beginning to understand were very long days. "What do you do when you're not here?" he asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether it was too personal. Vivian looked up from the watch, seeming surprised by the question. "I work," she said simply. "Corporate consulting." "Very boring compared to this. Nothing that creates something this beautiful could be boring." She smiled, but there was something rueful in her expression. "You'd be surprised. Most of what I do involves telling people how to make more money more efficiently. It's hardly artistic. But you're good at it." "Yes," she admitted. "I'm very good at it. My mother used to say I had inherited my father's business sense, but her romantic heart, and that the combination would either make me very successful or very unhappy." "And which has it been?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the workbench. "Both, I suppose. The success came easily enough. The happiness has been more elusive." Roberto chose that moment to shuffle down from upstairs, his cane tapping against the wooden steps. He'd developed a habit of appearing whenever Vivian visited, claiming he couldn't sleep, but clearly enjoying the conversation. Marco suspected his grandfather was playing matchmaker with the subtlety of someone who'd been married for 53 years. "Buenas noches, señorita," Roberto said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. "Good evening, Mr. Reyes. How are you feeling tonight?" "Like an old watch that needs winding more often each day," he replied with a chuckle. "But the spirit is willing, even if the body protests." Marco noticed how naturally Vivian interacted with his grandfather, showing the kind of respect for elders that spoke of good upbringing. She asked about his health with genuine concern, listened to his stories about the shop's history with interest rather than polite tolerance, and seemed genuinely charmed by his gentle humor. "Marco tells me you work in business consulting," Roberto said. "That must be challenging work." "Sometimes," Vivian replied, "though not as challenging as what your grandson does. This kind of craftsmanship requires a patience I'm not sure I possess." "Patience can be learned," Roberto observed, "but passion cannot be taught. Marco has both, which is why he can bring dead watches back to life." As the evening progressed, their conversation drifted from technical details about the restoration to more personal topics. Vivian spoke about her mother's love of beautiful objects, her belief that craftsmanship was a form of prayer. Marco shared stories about learning the trade from Roberto, about the satisfaction of solving mechanical puzzles that had stumped other repairers. The easy intimacy of their conversation felt natural, as if they'd known each other far longer than 2 weeks. When Vivian finally prepared to leave, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and Marco realized they'd been talking for almost 3 hours. "Thank you for letting me watch you work," she said, gathering her purse and jacket. "It's fascinating to see someone who truly loves what they do." "Thank you for being interested," Marco replied. "Most people think watch repair is arcane and boring. Most people don't understand the difference between a job and a calling." After she left, Roberto sat quietly for several minutes, his weathered hands folded over his cane. Finally, he spoke. "That woman understands something important, mijo." "What's that, abuelo?" "She understands the difference between what pays the bills and what feeds the soul. The question is whether she's brave enough to choose the soul over the bills." Marco continued working on the tiny gear, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about Vivian's admission that success hadn't brought happiness, about the way she watched him work with something that looked like longing. Roberto's words echoed in his thoughts as he made the final adjustments to the component that would complete his mother's watch. The gear was perfect. 17 teeth cut with mathematical precision, each surface polished to mirror brightness. It was a small triumph of craftsmanship over technology, of patience over expediency. But as Marco carefully placed it in its position within the movement, he found himself thinking less about the technical achievement and more about the woman who would soon wear this watch again, carrying her mother's memory and perhaps something new as well. The envelope arrived on a Friday morning, mixed among the usual collection of parts, catalogues, and utility bills. Marco almost discarded it with the junk mail until he noticed Roberto's name written in an elegant script across expensive stationery. Inside, a letter from Roberto's endocrinologist delivered news that hit like a physical blow. The diabetes that had been manageable for years was progressing more rapidly than expected. Roberto's kidneys were showing signs of stress. His circulation was compromised, and the doctor was recommending immediate changes to his treatment regimen, changes that would cost nearly $3,000 per month. Marco read the letter twice, then sat heavily in his grandfather's chair, the weight of the diagnosis settling over him like a shroud. $3,000. It might as well have been $3 million, even with the money from Vivian's restoration, even with the occasional high-end repairs. The shop couldn't sustain that kind of monthly expense. Roberto emerged from the back room, took one look at Marco's face, and understood immediately. "The test results?" he asked quietly. Marco handed him the letter, watching as his grandfather's expression remained stoic while reading the clinical details of his declining health. When Roberto finished, he folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "How much?" he asked simply. "Too much, abuelo, but we'll figure something out. Maybe I can take on more commercial work, or—" "Marco." Roberto's voice carried the authority of 8 decades of experience. "I have lived a good life. I have seen my family prosper. My grandson master the craft that has sustained us for 3 generations. I will not have you sacrifice everything for medical treatments that may only buy me a few more years." "Don't talk like that," Marco said fiercely. "You're not going anywhere. We'll find a way." But privately, Marco's mind was already racing through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. He could sell his tools, mortgage the shop, take a position with one of the high-end repair services downtown. The thought of leaving Roberto alone all day was heartbreaking, but the alternative was unthinkable. That evening, as Marco worked on the final details of Vivian's mother's watch, he found it difficult to concentrate. The beautiful mechanism that had occupied his thoughts for weeks now seemed insignificant compared to the medical bills accumulating in the shop's ledger. The same ledger that told the story of 3 generations was now recording what might be the family business's final chapter. Vivian arrived at her usual time, carrying coffee and pastries from the expensive shop 2 blocks over, a recent habit that both touched and embarrassed Marco. She took one look at his drawn expression and set down the bags. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his workbench. Marco hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion. "It's nothing you need to worry about, just family matters, Marco." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I've spent the last 3 weeks watching you work on my mother's watch. I've seen how you handle delicate things, how you treat what matters to other people. If something's troubling you, I'd like to help if I can." The kindness in her voice nearly undid him. Marco set down his tools and rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day's revelation. "My grandfather's medical condition is getting worse. The treatment he needs, it's expensive, more expensive than the shop can sustain." Vivian was quiet for a moment, and when Marco looked up, he saw understanding and concern in her eyes rather than the pity he'd feared. "How expensive?" "3,000 a month for medications and monitoring, maybe more if he needs specialized treatments. And the shop brings in—" Marco almost smiled at her direct approach. It was so different from the polite evasions most people offered in response to financial troubles. On a good month, maybe 1,500 profit after expenses, usually less. Vivian studied the repair ledger that lay open on the counter, its pages filled with Roberto's careful handwriting, documenting decades of modest transactions. "Your grandfather built something remarkable here," she said finally. "This shop, this place in the community, it's worth preserving." "Not if I can't keep him healthy," Marco replied. "I've been thinking about taking a position with Cartier or one of the other high-end houses. The pay would be better, enough to cover his medical expenses. But you'd have to leave the shop." "During the day, yes. I could still do some work here in the evenings, but—" Marco trailed off, knowing that without his full-time presence, the neighborhood relationships that sustained the business would gradually fade, and your grandfather would be alone. Marco nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. Vivian was quiet for several minutes, her fingers tracing patterns on the workbench as she appeared to be working through some internal calculation. Finally, she looked up. "What if there was another way?" "What do you mean? What if someone were to invest in the shop, provide capital for equipment, maybe help with marketing to bring in higher-end restoration work? The kind of projects that could support both the community work you do and your grandfather's medical needs." Marco felt a flush of heat in his cheeks. "Vivian, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept charity. This business has always paid its own way." "I'm not talking about charity," she replied, her business consultant's demeanor emerging. "I'm talking about investment. You have skills that are increasingly rare, a reputation among collectors, and a location that could attract customers from across the city if properly marketed. This could be a genuine business opportunity." "For who?" "You." Vivian hesitated, as if she hadn't expected the conversation to take this direction. "Possibly. I have some capital available for investment, and I understand the luxury goods market. More importantly, I understand the value of preserving something authentic in a world that increasingly favors the disposable." Marco stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was suggesting. "You barely know me. Why would you want to invest in a neighborhood watch repair shop?" "Because," she said simply, "I've spent the last 3 weeks watching you work. I've seen how you treat a broken timepiece like it's someone's heart, how you honor the craftsmanship of masters who died decades ago, how you care for your grandfather and your community. Those aren't qualities you find in a business plan, Marco. They're qualities you invest in when you're smart enough to recognize them." Roberto's voice came from the stairway, startling them both. "Mijo, bring the young lady upstairs. I want to show her something." They found Roberto in his small apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with a manila folder spread open before him. Inside were documents Marco had never seen, old photographs of the shop in its early days, newspaper clippings about Eduardo's reputation as a master craftsman, letters from satisfied customers dating back decades. "This shop has been many things over the years," Roberto said, gesturing to the photographs. "During the war, your great-grandfather repaired timing devices for the government. In the 60s, we specialized in railroad watches, when the trains still ran on time. In the 80s, we became known for vintage restoration, when collecting became popular." He picked up a faded photograph showing Eduardo surrounded by apprentices, teaching them the traditional techniques that would later become obsolete. The shop has always adapted to serve its time while preserving its principles. Perhaps it's time to adapt again. Vivian studied the photographs with the intensity she'd shown when examining her mother's watch. "Your family has been preserving more than just timepieces," she said. "You've been preserving a tradition, a way of approaching work that treats craftsmanship as sacred." "Exactly," Roberto replied. "And traditions survive by finding new ways to express old truths. If Marco is willing, and if you are serious about your offer, perhaps we can find a way for this tradition to not only survive, but flourish." As they talked late into the evening, discussing possibilities and logistics, Marco found himself caught between hope and caution. The idea of partnership with Vivian was both appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it could solve their immediate problems while preserving everything he valued about the shop. Terrifying because it would fundamentally change the relationship between them. But as he watched Vivian engage with Roberto's stories, as he saw her genuine interest in preserving the shop's character while expanding its reach, Marco began to believe that perhaps some changes were worth the risk. Perhaps, like his mother's watch, some broken things could be made not just functional, but better than before. The medical bills still sat on the kitchen counter, a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. But for the first time since reading the doctor's letter, Marco felt something other than despair. He felt possibility, tentative and fragile, but real nonetheless. The call from Herman Steiner came at 7 in the morning, 3 weeks after Marco had sent him detailed photographs of the Dubois watch for authentication. Marco answered groggily, expecting another update about parts availability. But Herman's voice carried an excitement that cut through his morning fog like cold water. "Marco, my young friend, you must sit down for this conversation." "I'm listening," Marco said, moving to Roberto's chair and noting his grandfather's immediate attention to the call. "The watch you are restoring, I have been researching its provenance, and what I have discovered will change everything. This is not just any Dubois piece. This is La Eternidad, the Eternity. It was commissioned in 1947 by a wealthy American industrialist for his bride, but it disappeared after the war. The horological community has been searching for it for 70 years. Marco felt the air leave his lungs. "Are you certain?" "The serial numbers match historical records exactly. But Marco, there is more. Yesterday I received a call from a collector in Geneva. Somehow word has begun to circulate that La Eternidad has been found. The collector is offering $2 million, sight unseen, for the piece. $2 million. Marco's voice came out as a whisper. "And that is merely the opening bid. At auction, with proper authentication and provenance documentation, this piece could sell for $3, possibly $4 million. It is not just a watch, my friend. It is a legend made real." After hanging up, Marco sat in stunned silence, while Roberto absorbed the magnitude of what they'd just learned. The watch Marco had been carefully restoring wasn't just valuable, it was historically significant, a piece that would attract international attention from collectors, museums, and media. "Vivian doesn't know," Roberto said quietly. "About the value, about what this discovery means." "No," Marco replied. "She said her mother never told her the exact details, just that it was special. This changes things, mijo. Once this news becomes public, everything changes." Marco was still processing the implications when his phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize with an international prefix. "Mr. Reyes? This is James Morrison from Sotheby's auction house in London. I understand you're in possession of the Dubois piece known as La Eternidad. I'd like to discuss representing the sale. I'm sorry, but we're prepared to guarantee a minimum auction price of $3 million, with estimates potentially reaching $5 million. When might we arrange to examine the piece?" Marco ended the call without responding, but it was followed by another, then another. Word was spreading through the international collecting community with viral speed. By noon, his phone was ringing constantly. Auction houses, private collectors, museums and journalists all wanting to know about the legendary Dubois watch that had suddenly reappeared after 7 decades. The shop, usually a peaceful sanctuary, became a whirlwind of activity as reporters began showing up uninvited. Marco had to lock the door and post a "closed for private business" sign to keep them at bay. Through the windows, he could see photographers trying to capture images of the interior, hoping for a glimpse of the mythical timepiece. It was in this chaos that Vivian arrived for her usual afternoon visit, pushing through a crowd of reporters and camera crews that had gathered outside the shop. Marco let her in quickly, then immediately locked the door behind her. "What is all this?" she asked, looking bewildered by the media circus surrounding the modest shop. Marco took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to tell her would fundamentally alter their relationship. "Your mother's watch. It's not just any Dubois piece. It's La Eternidad, one of the most famous lost watches in horological history. It's worth millions of dollars, and somehow word has gotten out that it's been found." Vivian stared at him, her face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that looked like fear. Millions? How many millions? Conservative estimates start at 3 million. At auction, possibly 5 or more. She sank into Roberto's chair, her usual composure completely shattered. $5 million for my mother's watch. "Vivian, I need you to know that I haven't spoken to anyone about this. I don't know how. The information leaked, but—" "Oh God," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're going to find out who I am." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Vivian looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her carefully maintained privacy cracked completely. "My name isn't just Vivian. It's Vivian Langford, as in Langford Industries, as in one of the wealthiest families in the country." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Langford Industries, the multinational conglomerate that owned everything from tech companies to real estate empires. The Langford family regularly appeared on Forbes lists, their wealth estimated in the billions, and Vivian was part of that dynasty. "You're a billionaire," Marco said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "My family is. I have a trust fund that's worth more than most people see in a lifetime, but I don't live like—" She stopped, running her hands through her hair. "I wanted to be just Vivian when I came here, not the Langford heiress, not the woman whose business decisions affect thousands of jobs, not the target for every fortune hunter and social climber in the city. Just someone getting her mother's watch repaired." The revelation hit Marco like a physical blow. Every conversation they'd had, every moment of connection he'd felt, every business partnership they'd discussed, all of it had been based on a fundamental deception. She wasn't just wealthy, she was astronomically rich, operating in a world so far removed from his that they might as well have been different species. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, trying to keep the hurt out of his voice. "Because of this," she said, gesturing toward the chaos outside. "Because the moment people know who I am, everything changes. Every kindness becomes calculated, every relationship becomes transactional, every conversation becomes about what I can do for someone rather than who I am as a person." Roberto had been listening quietly, but now he spoke with the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature for 8 decades. "The young lady has been protecting something precious," he said gently, "the chance to be valued for herself rather than her inheritance." "But I should have told you," Vivian said, tears beginning to form in her eyes, "especially after we started talking about business partnerships. I was going to, I swear. I was afraid you'd look at me differently." Marco stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman he'd grown to care about with the revelation of her true identity. Part of him felt betrayed, manipulated by her deception, but another part understood the loneliness that must come with that kind of wealth, the constant uncertainty about people's motives. His phone rang again, cutting through the tension. This time it was a local news station. Mr. Reyes, we understand you're in possession of the famous La Eternidad watch, and that you've been working closely with Vivian Langford, the billionaire heiress. Could you comment on your relationship with Ms. Langford, and whether the Langford family is planning to auction the piece? Marco hung up without responding, but the damage was done. Somehow, the media had connected the dots between the watch and Vivian's identity. Their private world was about to become very public. "They know," he said simply. Vivian's face went pale. "My family doesn't know about any of this. They don't know about the watch, about you, about anything. When this story breaks..." She looked toward the windows where reporters were still gathered. "I have to call my lawyers, my publicist. This is going to be a nightmare." As she reached for her phone, Marco felt the gulf between their worlds opening like a chasm. The woman he'd been falling for was about to disappear into a world of lawyers and publicists and media management, while he remained in his small shop, suddenly infamous as the man who discovered one of the world's most valuable timepieces. The watch that had brought them together was about to tear them apart, and Marco couldn't see any way to repair the damage that was coming. Outside, the crowd of reporters continued to grow, their cameras pointed at the shop like weapons. Inside, two people who had found something precious in each other's company sat in stunned silence, watching their private connection become public property. The certificate from the Swiss Horological Institute lay on Marco's workbench. Official documentation that would confirm La Eternidad's authenticity and probably make the media frenzy even worse. As he looked at the formal document with its impressive seals and signatures, Marco realized that some discoveries, no matter how valuable, came with a price too high to pay. The completed watch sat in its custom presentation case, a masterpiece of horological artistry restored to perfection. Every gear turned with silky precision, every surface gleamed with the patina of careful restoration, and the hidden compartment once again secured Elena's photograph in its secret chamber. After 4 weeks of painstaking work, La Eternidad was alive again, its mechanism beating with the steady rhythm that had captivated Jacques Dubois 76 years earlier. But the beauty of the completed timepiece felt hollow in the aftermath of the media storm that had engulfed both Marco's shop and Vivian's life. 3 days had passed since her true identity was revealed. 3 days during which their worlds had been turned upside down by forces neither had anticipated or wanted. The shop remained closed to the public, its windows covered with newspapers, to block the persistent photographers who maintained their vigil outside. Inside, Marco worked in a strange isolation, fielding calls from auction houses, museums, and collectors while trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred. The woman he'd been falling for was a billionaire heiress. The watch he'd restored was worth more than he could have imagined, and their private connection had become tabloid fodder. Roberto's health had taken a downturn during the stress of recent events. The excitement and chaos had triggered a diabetic episode that landed him in the hospital for 2 days of observation. Now back home, but weakened, he spent most of his time in bed, his medications adjusted, but his spirit clearly affected by the upheaval. Marco sat beside his grandfather's bed, the weight of accumulated stress evident in his posture. "The doctor says you need to avoid excitement, but how can we avoid it when there are reporters camped outside our front door?" "This too shall pass, mijo," Roberto said, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "Storms blow through, but the mountains remain. The mountains are being eroded by this particular storm, abuelo. I haven't been able to work on regular repairs for 3 days. Mrs. Patterson couldn't get through the crowd for her weekly visit. Miguel's mother won't let him come to the shop because of all the cameras." Roberto studied his grandson's face with concern. "And the señorita, Vivian?" Marco's expression darkened. "I haven't heard from her since she left to deal with her family situation. 3 days, abuelo. No calls, no visits, nothing. I think she's realized that whatever connection we had isn't worth the complications it's causing in her real life." The truth was more painful than Marco wanted to admit. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights replaying their last conversation, analyzing every word and gesture for signs he'd missed about her true identity. The investment opportunity she'd offered now seemed calculated rather than spontaneous. A wealthy woman's casual solution to a problem that represented his family's entire livelihood. His phone buzzed with another call from an international collector, the 15th that morning. Marco let it go to voicemail, along with the dozens of other messages from people who wanted to buy, display, or simply see the legendary timepiece. The watch that had brought meaning to his work now felt like a burden, its value somehow diminishing. The craftsmanship he'd invested in its restoration, a soft knock at the shop's back door, interrupted his brooding. Marco descended the stairs cautiously, expecting another reporter who'd found the alley entrance. Instead, he found Mrs. Chen standing in the narrow space, holding a covered dish and looking worried. "Marco, dear, how are you holding up?" she asked as he let her in. "The whole neighborhood's been talking about what's happening here." "I'm managing, Mrs. Chen. Thank you for coming by." She set the dish on his workbench, homemade soup from the smell of it. "That woman on the news, the one they say you've been working with, she seemed very nice when I met her here a few weeks ago." "You met Vivian?" "Oh, yes. She stopped by my apartment building looking for information about local businesses. She was asking about the neighborhood, about how long families had been here, what challenges we faced. Very thoughtful questions, not like some of these developers who just want to know property values." Marco stared at Mrs. Chen, processing this new information. "When was this?" "About 2 weeks ago, I think. She said she was considering some kind of community investment project. I told her about your shop, about how your family had been here for generations, about Roberto's medical situation." Mrs. Chen paused, noting Marco's surprised expression. "She didn't tell you about this conversation?" Before Marco could respond, another knock came at the back door. This time, it was Carlos from the auto shop, followed by Miguel's mother, then the Patel family from the corner market. One by one, the neighbors who formed the heart of the shop's community gathered in the crowded space, each bringing food, concern, and solidarity. "We wanted you to know," Carlos said, speaking for the group, "that this media circus doesn't change anything. You're still our watchmaker, still part of this neighborhood. Whatever happens with that fancy watch, we're here for you." As the impromptu gathering continued, Marco learned more about Vivian's visits to the neighborhood. She had spoken with numerous residents, asking about local businesses, community needs, and the challenges of rising rents and gentrification. She had inquired specifically about Roberto's health and the shop's financial situation, gathering information that went far beyond casual curiosity. The picture that emerged was of someone who had been conducting detailed research before offering her investment partnership, someone who understood the community dynamics and genuinely cared about preserving what made the neighborhood special. It wasn't the spontaneous offer of a wealthy woman looking for a tax write-off. It was a carefully considered plan, developed by someone who valued what the shop represented. Miguel, who had been listening quietly to the adults' conversation, finally spoke up. "Mr. Marco, is the lady with the pretty watch going to help you save the shop?" "I don't know, Miguel. I hope so, but things are complicated right now. My mum says rich people sometimes help when they understand why something matters," the boy continued with the directness of childhood. "Did you tell her why the shop matters?" The question hit Marco with unexpected force. Had he explained to Vivian what the shop truly meant, not just as a business, but as a cornerstone of community life, a place where 3 generations had practiced their craft while serving neighbors who'd become family? Had he articulated the deeper purpose that went beyond mere profit? As the neighbors gradually departed, each offering final words of support, Marco found himself reconsidering everything that had happened since Vivian's true identity was revealed. Perhaps her research hadn't been deception, but due diligence. Perhaps her silence wasn't abandonment, but the need to manage a crisis that threatened both their privacy and her family's reputation. That evening, as Marco worked on routine repairs that had accumulated during the media siege, he made a decision. He carefully packaged the completed La Eternidad in its presentation case, along with all the documentation proving its authenticity and provenance. Whatever happened between him and Vivian, she deserved to have her mother's watch returned to hold the timepiece that connected her to Elena's love story. Roberto had fallen asleep in his chair beside the workbench, his breathing steady but labored. The medical bills still sat in their manila folder, a reminder that the larger problems remained unsolved, regardless of how the watch situation was resolved. The shop's future still hung in the balance, dependent on finding a way to balance community service with financial sustainability. But as Marco looked at the completed timepiece, its crystal clear, its movement precise, its hidden compartment once again protecting Elena's photograph, he felt a sense of completion that went beyond the technical aspects of the restoration. He had honored the craftsmanship of Jacques Dubois, preserved a family treasure, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrated that some things in the world were still treated with the care and respect they deserved. The question now was whether that demonstration had been enough to bridge the gulf between two very different worlds. Whether the connection he'd felt with Vivian could survive the revelation of who she really was and what her world demanded of her. Tomorrow, he would call her and arrange to return the watch. Tomorrow, he would learn whether their story had ended with the completion of the restoration or was just beginning a new chapter. Tonight, he simply sat with his sleeping grandfather and the fruits of 4 weeks' patient labor, listening to the steady tick of La Eternidad and hoping that some things, once broken, could indeed be made whole again. The morning news van arrived at 6 a.m., followed by a photographer from the Times, then a crew from Channel 7. By 8 o'clock, the street outside Reyes Watch Repair resembled a media encampment, complete with satellite trucks and reporters, doing live broadcasts about the humble mechanic who discovered horological history. Marco watched the circus from his upstairs window, the completed La Eternidad resting in its presentation case on the kitchen table. He'd made his decision during the sleepless hours before dawn. He would return the watch to Vivian today, regardless of the media attention, regardless of their complicated situation. She deserved to have her mother's treasure back, and he deserved to close this chapter of his life with dignity intact. His phone had been ringing constantly since sunrise. Auction houses were making increasingly aggressive offers. Collectors were promising ridiculous sums for private sales, and museums were suggesting preservation partnerships that would generate publicity for years. Marco had stopped answering after the 15th call, letting the voicemail fill with proposals that reduced Elena's love story to dollar signs and marketing opportunities. Roberto remained upstairs, too weak to navigate the media gauntlet below, but insistent that Marco handle the situation as he saw fit. "Trust your heart, mijo," had been his grandfather's advice over their quiet breakfast. The watch came to us for a reason. Honor that reason. At precisely 10 o'clock, Marco made his way downstairs and unlocked the shop's front door. The effect was immediate. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashed, and a barrage of questions assaulted him from all directions. "Mr. Reyes, can you confirm the watch's value? Have you been in contact with the Langford family? Will you be selling La Eternidad at auction? What's your relationship with Vivian Langford?" Marco raised his hand for silence, surprised when the crowd actually quieted. "I have a brief statement," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The watch known as La Eternidad has been fully restored and will be returned to its rightful owner today. That's all I have to say." "But Mr. Reyes," called out a reporter from the front row, "sources say you and Ms. Langford have been romantically involved. Can you comment on—" "No," Marco said firmly. "This is about craftsmanship, not gossip." He was about to retreat into the shop when a black sedan pushed through the crowd. its windows tinted dark against the photographer's flashes. Marco's heart stopped as he recognized the vehicle that had dropped Vivian off several times during her evening visits. But when the rear door opened, it wasn't Vivian who emerged. Instead, a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, flanked by two equally well-dressed companions who had the unmistakable bearing of corporate lawyers. The man surveyed the media circus with the cold assessment of someone accustomed to controlling narratives, then walked directly toward Marco with the confidence of inherited authority. "Mr. Reyes," he said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm William Langford, Vivian's brother. We need to talk." The crowd of reporters exploded with fresh energy, recognizing the arrival of another member of the Billionaire Langford dynasty. Cameras blinked furiously as William Langford stood on the shop's threshold, his presence transforming the scene from local interest story to major financial news. "Privately," William added, glancing meaningfully at the media crowd. Marco hesitated, then stepped aside to allow the three men into his shop. The contrast was stark. Their tailored suits and polished shoes looked absurdly out of place among the worn wooden cases and humble workbenches that defined the space. William Langford examined the shop's interior with the same calculating expression he'd shown the media crowd. His companions remained silent, their roles clearly defined as observers and enforcers, rather than participants in whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Where is my sister?" William asked without preamble. "I was hoping you could tell me," Marco replied, noting how the man's question carried the assumption that Vivian was somehow Marco's responsibility. "She's been avoiding the family since this situation developed. Her phone goes straight to voicemail, her apartment is empty, and our security team hasn't been able to locate her." William's tone suggested this was somehow Marco's fault. "The last communication we received was a text saying she was handling a personal matter and would be in touch soon." Marco felt a chill of worry override his annoyance at William's accusatory manner. "When was this?" "3 days ago, the same day the media attention began." William stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Mr. Reyes, my family has worked very hard to maintain our privacy and reputation. This situation, my sister's involvement with a neighborhood watch repairman, the media circus, the tabloid speculation about romance, it's unacceptable." "Your sister is an adult capable of making her own decisions," Marco replied, his temper beginning to rise. "My sister is worth approximately $2 billion, William shot back. "That makes her a target for every fortune hunter, con artist, and social climber in the world. Forgive me if I'm skeptical about the motives of someone who just happened to discover one of history's most valuable watches while befriending a billionaire heiress." The accusation hit Marco like a physical blow. The implication that he had somehow orchestrated the entire situation, that his feelings for Vivian were motivated by greed rather than genuine affection, was so far from the truth that he struggled to formulate a response. "I think you should leave," Marco said quietly. "Not without the watch," William replied. "La Eternidad belongs to my family, and I'm here to retrieve it. It belongs to your sister, and I'll return it to her personally." "My sister is clearly not thinking rationally about this situation. As her legal representative, I'm authorized to act on her behalf." One of the silent companions stepped forward, producing a legal document. "This gives me power of attorney for all matters related to her inherited property, including items that belonged to our mother." Marco stared at the document, recognizing official letterhead and legal language, but understanding that accepting it would mean betraying Vivian's trust. Whatever was happening between them, whatever complications had driven her into hiding, she had entrusted him with her mother's watch. That trust meant more than any legal document. "I'm sorry," Marco said, "but I made a promise to return the watch to Vivian personally. I intend to keep that promise." William Langford's expression hardened into something that revealed the steel beneath his polished exterior. "Mr. Reyes, I don't think you understand what you're dealing with," My family has resources that could make your life very difficult if you choose to be unreasonable about this." The threat hung in the air like a challenge, and Marco realized that this confrontation was about more than just the watch. It was about power, about class, about the assumption that wealth could override personal integrity. Outside, the media crowd continued their vigil, unknowingly documenting a moment that would define everything that came next. The standoff between Marco and William Langford was interrupted by the sound of Roberto's cane tapping down the wooden stairs. Despite his recent hospitalization, the old man descended slowly but with determination, his weathered hands steady. On the banister, the lawyers shifted uncomfortably as Roberto emerged, his dignity intact despite his obvious frailty. "Senor Langford," Roberto said with formal politeness, "welcome to our shop. I am Roberto Reyes, Marco's grandfather." William turned, his corporate mask slipping slightly in the face of Roberto's courtly manner. "Mr. Reyes, I'm here about my family's property." "Ah, yes, the beautiful watch." Roberto nodded, settling carefully into his chair. "Your mother had exquisite taste. Elena, was it not? The photograph your sister found was quite lovely." "You've seen the photograph?" William's voice sharpened with interest. "Of course, a Dubois always included secret places for treasures. Your mother understood that some things are too precious for public display." Roberto's eyes, still sharp despite his physical decline, studied William with the wisdom of 8 decades. "She would be proud that her daughter found someone who treats her memory with such care." From his jacket pocket, Roberto withdrew a small velvet pouch that Marco had never seen before. With careful movements, he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring, worn smooth by years of wear. "This belonged to my beloved wife, Carmen. 53 years we were married, and she wore this ring every day until the arthritis made it too painful." Roberto held the ring up to catch the light. "When she died, I had it made into a pendant, so I could keep her close to my heart. Some treasures are worth more than money, senor. They are worth the love that created them." William stared at the simple ring, his aggressive posture softening slightly. "I'm sure that's very touching, but this is a legal matter. The watch represents millions of dollars and significant family heritage." "You speak of heritage," Roberto replied gently, "but heritage is not about ownership. It is about understanding. Your sister understands what her mother's watch represents. That is why she brought it here, to someone who would honor its story, rather than simply calculate its value." Before William could respond, the sound of car doors slamming outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Marco could see the media crowd repositioning their cameras as a familiar figure pushed through their ranks. Vivian. She moved with purpose despite the chaos, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes as she approached. The shop. Her usual polished appearance had given way to jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked tired but determined, and when her eyes met Marco's through the window, he saw an apology and something deeper, a resolution that suggested she had made important decisions during her 3-day absence. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, bringing with her the energy of someone who had been preparing for this confrontation. She took in the scene quickly, her brother's threatening posture, the lawyers flanking him, Marco's defensive stance, and Roberto's calm presence in his chair. "William," she said simply, "I should have known you'd try something like this." "Vivian." "Thank God." William's relief was genuine, though his authoritative tone remained. "We've been worried sick. You can't just disappear when the family's dealing with a crisis. The only crisis here is the one you're creating," Vivian replied, moving to stand beside Marco. "This is my mother's watch, my decision about what to do with it, and my relationship to manage or end as I see fit." "Your relationship?" William's voice rose dangerously. "Vivian, this man has manipulated you from the beginning. He discovers a priceless watch, and suddenly you're spending every evening in this neighborhood. The timing is suspicious, to say the least." Marco felt heat rise in his face, but before he could respond, Vivian stepped forward with the commanding presence she'd clearly inherited from generations of powerful ancestors. "Marco didn't manipulate anyone, William. I researched this neighborhood for weeks before I brought my mother's watch here. I chose him specifically because his reputation for integrity is legendary among serious collectors. I started visiting in the evenings because I was fascinated by watching a true craftsman work, and because I found myself caring about someone who treats other people's treasures like they're sacred." She turned to Marco, her eyes holding an intensity that made his heart race. "I disappeared for 3 days because I needed to make some decisions about my life, about what matters to me and what I'm willing to fight for. I've spent my entire adult life letting my family's expectations and other people's assumptions dictate my choices. Not anymore." From her purse, Vivian withdrew a single piece of paper and held it out to William. "That's my resignation from the Langford Industries Board of Directors. I'm keeping my trust fund because I earned it by being born into this family, but I'm done pretending that money is the most important thing in my life." William stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. "Vivian, you can't be serious. You're throwing away everything our family has built for—" He gestured dismissively at the modest shop around them. "I'm not throwing anything away," Vivian replied firmly. "I'm choosing something better, something real." Roberto cleared his throat softly, drawing attention back to his weathered hands, which now held a different object. A simple metal band, clearly handmade, with tiny engravings around its circumference. "Mijo," he said to Marco, "perhaps it is time to give the señorita her ring." Marco stared at his grandfather in shock, recognizing the band as one of the pieces Roberto had been working on during quiet moments over the past 2 weeks. The old man's secret project, the careful filing and polishing he'd been doing when he thought no one was watching. It had been a ring. With hands that trembled slightly, Marco accepted the simple band from Roberto, seeing now the tiny watch gears that had been incorporated into the design, the delicate engravings that spelled out words in Spanish and English, "Tiempo para amar," time for love. As he looked up at Vivian, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her eyes, Marco realized that some repairs went far beyond fixing broken mechanisms. Sometimes they were about mending hearts, bridging worlds, and creating something new from pieces that had never been meant to fit together. 6 months later, the morning light filtered through newly cleaned windows of Reyes Watch Repair, illuminating a shop that had been lovingly restored while maintaining its essential character. The wooden cases still lined the walls, but now they held an expanded collection that included both neighborhood timepieces and museum-quality vintage pieces. The workbenches remained in their traditional positions, but they were equipped with the finest tools money could buy, allowing Marco to practice his craft at the highest level while still serving Mrs. Patterson's weekly needs and Miguel's curious questions. Roberto sat in his familiar chair, his health stabilized by the excellent medical care that proper insurance and regular treatment had provided. His diabetes was well controlled now, his medications current, and his spirits lifted by the constant activity surrounding him. The ledger that had once recorded financial struggles now documented the success of what had become known as the Reyes Langford Heritage Workshop, a partnership that preserved traditional craftsmanship while building a sustainable business. The marriage ceremony had taken place on a warm Sunday morning in April, right there in the shop, among the ticking clocks and the tools of Marco's trade. Vivian had insisted on the location, wanting to exchange vows in the place where they'd discovered what mattered most to them. Father Martinez from the neighborhood church had performed the service, with Roberto serving as both best man and the voice of family wisdom that had guided them through their complicated courtship. The guest list had reflected the merger of 2 very different worlds. Mrs. Chen sat beside museum curators, Miguel's family shared pews with Swiss horological experts, and William Langford, who had eventually come to accept his sister's choices, found himself charmed by Carlos's stories about restoring classic cars. The reception, held in the small courtyard behind the shop, had featured both Carlos's excellent barbecue and catering from the city's finest restaurants. Now, on this particular morning, Marco worked on a pocket watch that belonged to a collector. In Tokyo, while Vivian managed correspondence with museums interested in their restoration services, she had discovered a talent for the business side of craftsmanship, using her corporate experience to build relationships with collectors and institutions while protecting the shop's community character. The wedding rings they wore were Marco's masterwork, bands he had crafted himself, using techniques learned from Roberto, and gold, recycled from broken jewelry that customers had donated over the years. Each ring incorporated tiny gears from vintage timepieces, so that their marriage literally carried forward the mechanical poetry that had brought them together. "Mrs. Delacroix is here for her husband's Longines," Vivian announced, looking up from her correspondence. She had embraced the rhythm of the shop, learning to read customers' needs and emotions as skillfully as Marco read the condition of their timepieces. Mrs. Delacroix entered with her usual weekly offering of homemade bread, accepting the restored watch with tears of gratitude. The Longines had belonged to her late husband, a gift for their 50th wedding anniversary that had stopped working shortly after his death. Marco had spent weeks sourcing a replacement movement, not because the repair was particularly profitable, but because some things were worth preserving regardless of their monetary value. "Merci beaucoup," Mrs. Delacroix said, pressing the bread into Vivian's hands. "You have given me my Henri back." After she left, Vivian turned to Marco with the expression of someone still amazed by the emotional weight of their work. "I had a conference call with the Smithsonian this morning. They want to discuss a collaboration for their upcoming exhibition on American time-piping history. What did you tell them?" "That we'd consider it if they understood that this isn't just about displaying valuable objects. It's about honoring the stories behind them, the craftsmen who created them, and the families who treasured them." Marco smiled, recognizing how completely Vivian had embraced the philosophy that governed their work. The woman who had once measured success in quarterly earnings now understood that some achievements couldn't be quantified. The afternoon brought a familiar routine of regular customers and community connections. Miguel arrived after school to help with organizing tools and to listen to Roberto's stories about the great watchmakers of the past. Mrs. Patterson made her weekly visit, her husband's Bulova keeping perfect time, but her need for human connection requiring regular attention. Young couples brought engagement presents for repair, elderly customers entrusted heirloom pieces to their care, and serious collectors sought their expertise for complex restorations. But the day's most significant moment came near closing time, when a young woman entered carrying a small jewelry box with the reverent care that suggested family treasure. Inside was a lady's Omega from the 1960s, its crystal cracked and its movement silent. "This was my grandmother's," the woman explained. "She wore it every day until she died last month. The family says I should just buy a new watch, but this one carries her time with you," Marco finished gently, accepting the timepiece with the careful attention he'd learned to give to other people's memories. As the woman left with Marco's and promised to call when the restoration was complete, Vivian watched her husband examine the damaged watch with the same reverence he'd shown her mother's timepiece 9 months earlier. Some things never changed, and some changes were worth everything. That evening, as they closed the shop and climbed the stairs to their apartment above, now expanded to include Vivian's belongings and decorated with photographs from their unconventional courtship, Marco reflected on the peculiar mathematics of happiness. He had gained a wife, a business partner, and financial security, but he had also preserved everything that mattered most: his grandfather's wisdom, his community's trust, and his commitment to treating time as something sacred. Roberto dozed, peacefully in his chair beside the evening news. The medical crisis that had once threatened everything, now just a memory managed by excellent care and family love. The shop below ticked steadily with the rhythm of dozens of restored timepieces, each one carrying its own story of preservation and renewal. In her mother's restored watch, Vivian carried Elena's photograph and the memory of a love story that had inspired her own. In their marriage, she had found something that no amount of inherited wealth could have purchased. A partnership based on shared values rather than social expectations. A love grounded in mutual respect rather than mutual advantage. As they settled into their evening routine, Marco reading horological journals while Vivian planned their next day's appointments, the sound of ticking filled their home like a mechanical lullaby. Time moved forward, as it always had and always would. But now it carried with it the promise that some things, once broken, could indeed be made whole again, and that the best repairs were often those that created something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its own evening rhythm, secure in the knowledge that Reyes Watch Repair would continue to serve its community while reaching toward a larger world, proving that tradition and progress could coexist when guided by wisdom, patience, and love.